Hindu temple, a mosque, a Chinese shrine, a Catholic cathedral. They don't just exist on the same map. They are part of the exact same morning commute. This is Mauritius, a tiny volcanic dot isolated in the vastness of the Indian Ocean. Its people carry the ancestry, the languages, and the historical scars of Africa, Madagascar, India, China, and Europe. In the highlands of Chamarel, there is a stretch of earth naturally dyed in 7 distinct colors. No matter how hard you shake them together, they refuse to mix into a single shade. The society of this island is remarkably similar. These communities have never melted down into one uniform culture. But for over 2 centuries, they have mastered the quiet art of sharing the same markets, the same roads, the same schools, and the exact same future. Many of us live in cities far more crowded than Mauritius, surrounded by millions of people. Yet, we know fewer of our neighbors than ever before. Perhaps that is why the story of this island isn't just about them. It is a quiet reminder of what the rest of us are slowly losing. How did people who arrived on this island through entirely different and often brutal paths learn to call the exact same piece of land home? The answer isn't found in a peace treaty. It is hidden in a towering mountain that once shielded those fleeing for their lives, in a local market where trust holds more weight than paper, and on an exhausting road where people of one faith will stand for hours just to hand a cup of water to someone of another. But long before humans learned to share this island, fire and ocean had to create it first. Millions of years ago, a massive volcano erupted beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean. It kept erupting, cooling, and building upon itself until it breached the water, leaving behind jagged pieces of basalt rock. Today, the fire is gone, replaced by dramatic cliffs, deep volcanic craters, and fertile highlands blanketed in green. Surrounding this volcanic land is a perfect ring of turquoise. This coral reef acts as a fortress, breaking the immense power of the open ocean before it can reach the shores. At the edge of this reef, the ocean floor suddenly drops into a deep trench. Creating the breathtaking illusion of an underwater waterfall, a mesmerizing trick of ocean currents pulling sand into the abyss. But geography here is not just scenery. It is a force that dictates daily life. Mauritius is a small dot, utterly isolated from the world's major landmasses. Because of this isolation, nature is never just a background. A single delayed cargo ship can immediately shift the price of vegetables in the local market. A passing cyclone doesn't just ruin a vacation, it paralyzes the entire island's supply chain. And when a stretch of the coral reef weakens, it simultaneously threatens the fisherman casting his net, the luxury hotel on the beach, and the families who rely on both to survive. Nature here steps directly into the plates and pockets of the people. In the early hours before dawn, a small boat carefully navigates the shallow lagoon. A fisherman pulls his net from the fragile reef, transferring his catch into buckets. By sunrise, a truck carries those fish away from the coast. And just a few hours later, they will change hands amid the chaos of the central market in Port Louis. The volcano created the land, the ocean isolated it, but it was the empires on the other side of the world that would eventually bring the people. We do not start with population statistics. We start with a vast green field, a sharp blade slicing through a thick stalk of sugarcane, the heavy, grinding turn of a crushing wheel, the slow crystallization of raw sugar, and finally, a glass of aged rum resting on a table in a sunlit modern resort. For centuries, sugarcane was the relentless engine of this island. And to feed that engine, European colonial powers needed hands. The diversity of Mauritius was not born out of a peaceful global gathering. These communities did not meet in a festival. They collided inside an economy that demanded labor, sugar, ports, and land. First came the enslaved people, forcibly taken from Africa and Madagascar to work the plantations under brutal conditions. When slavery was finally abolished, the fields still demanded to be harvested. This birthed the Great Experiment. Hundreds of thousands of indentured laborers, primarily from India, were brought across the ocean, stepping foot onto the worn stone steps of Apravasi Ghat. They arrived with contracts, yet they stepped into a life dictated by harsh realities and an immense imbalance of power. Chinese merchants soon followed, weaving themselves into the island's trading network. While the European descendants maintained control over the capital and the estates, not all of us know the terror of being forced from our homeland. But many of us understand the quiet weight of having to start over in a place that holds none of our memories. A new house, a new city, or sometimes a new country, where our children will eventually speak a language different from our own. The people of Mauritius did not arrive by the same choice. While some stepped onto the island through the crowded docks, others looked up at the towering basalt peak of Le Morne, seeking the treacherous mountains just to escape it. But history eventually turns the page. Many generations later, the descendants of these fractured beginnings no longer live within the confines of colonial records. Today, they meet every morning in a much more ordinary place, the market. Long before the sun rises, the island's circulatory system awakens. Fishermen return to the quiet docks with the night's catch. Heavy trucks, loaded with fresh vegetables, roll down from the cool highlands toward the capital of Port Louis. Inside the central market, vendors sweep the floors of their stalls. Goods are unboxed, weighed, and meticulously arranged. A pair of hands presses into soft dough, preparing the first batch of dal puri for the day. By the time the city fully opens its eyes, the market is a symphony of motion. Office workers stop for a quick breakfast. Students wait in neat lines for their buses. A vendor calls out to customers in rhythmic Creole, while a radio in the background murmurs the morning news in French. Above them, administrative signs point the way in English. In these narrow aisles, Hindu, Creole, Sino-Mauritian, and Muslim families navigate the exact same space, buying from and selling to one another. This market is the beating heart of Mauritius. Vegetables from the volcanic plateaus, fish from the turquoise lagoons, spices from the shipping docks, and small coins from the pockets of laborers all flow through here. Every item changes hands multiple times before it ever becomes a meal. Follow a single coin. A laborer buys 2 warm dal puras. The food vendor uses that same coin to buy vegetables. The vegetable seller pays the truck driver, who then buys fuel or takes the money back to his family. The currency never stands still. But what truly keeps this system moving isn't just money. It is familiarity and trust. Regular customers have the best produce quietly saved for them under the counter. A transaction might be settled on a nod and a promise to pay tomorrow. The market doubles as the island's true news network. A place where people share the changing price of tomatoes, an opening for a job, or news of a newborn. Any goods left unsold at the end of the day are often sold at a fraction of the price, taken home or quietly shared. Listen closely to the rhythm of the morning. The soft thud of flour hitting a wooden table, the rapid, practiced motion of a vendor folding warm flatbread into wax paper, a movement repeated thousands of times. A customer places a few coins on the counter, but the vendor is already handing over the food, having known their order before they even spoke. Perhaps many of us remember growing up in a neighborhood where the local shopkeeper knew our family's name. When we look back, what we miss isn't necessarily the things we bought. It is the profound, quiet comfort of being recognized. But what is traded in the market is only the visible surface. The deeper layers of Mauritius are kept out of sight, preserved inside the kitchen, in the voices of grandparents, and in the rituals that begin only after the front door is closed. We move away from the crowded streets of Port Louis, down into a quiet Creole village near Chamarel, across to a neighborhood built by the descendants of Indian laborers, and inside the walls of a multi-generational home. Inside these houses, the island's history is spoken aloud. Adults prepare the evening meal while conversing in rapid Creole. Children sit nearby, finishing their schoolwork in English. In the corner, a television broadcasts the evening news in French, while grandparents might quietly speak to each other in Bhojpuri, Hindi, or Tamil. The island is highly multilingual, but these languages do not all hold the same power. Some belong to the government, others to the street, and some belong only to the past. Follow a single dinner plate, and you can trace centuries of migration. It might hold a piece of dol puri, served alongside rugai, a rich tomato and garlic stew brought by Creole ancestors. There could be fish fresh from the lagoon, a side of sharp pickled vegetables, and perhaps a bowl of steamed boulettes from the Sino-Mauritian community. All washed down with a cold glass of sweet, milky alauda. This is not simply 4 distinct cuisines placed next to each other. It is the result of generations of borrowing, adjusting to the local climate, and learning to share what little they had. As evening falls on a local beach, the rhythm of the island shifts. It does not begin on a brightly lit tourist stage. It begins with a wooden frame drum, a ravan being carefully warmed over an open fire to tighten its skin. The seed-filled rattle of the maraven joins the beat. An elder begins to sing in Creole, and soon, children who were just watching are pulled into the movement. This is sega. Born from enslaved Africans on the colonial sugar plantations, it was a vital way to release the exhaustion of the fields, to preserve their stolen voices, and to sing the human experiences they were not allowed to speak. Here, culture is not a rigid performance, it is an everyday reflex. It is a spare chair being quickly pulled up when a neighbor unexpectedly drops by. It is a plate of food placed in the center of the table rather than divided into individual portions. It is an old song starting up in the evening breeze before anyone even realizes they are singing along. In many of our own families, there are words that once belonged to our grandparents but are no longer used by our children. A language rarely vanishes in a single day. It leaves quietly, bit by bit, through family dinners where no one is left to answer in the old tongue. These fading memories are carefully protected within the walls of the home. But the moment the front door opens, Mauritius is stepping into a vastly different economy, moving far faster than the rhythm of the Ravan. Out in the rural expanse, the morning still belongs to the earth. Laborers move through the dense sugarcane fields, while others tend to tea plantations and highland vegetable plots. Fishermen ready their boats, and the island's intricate supply chain of food begins to move. But at the exact same hour, a different Mauritius awakens. In Ebene and Port Louis, thousands of office workers board buses and the light rail. They step into gleaming glass towers, housing finance, technology, and corporate services. These modern monoliths stand tall on an island that once depended almost entirely on the harvest of a single crop. Mauritius has transformed rapidly, shifting from a plantation economy to textiles, and now to a hub of digital and financial services. Yet, these new industries cannot exist in a vacuum. They are deeply tethered to the island's physical limits, relying heavily on imported energy, global connectivity, and most importantly, the invisible support system of the Mauritian family. Follow the daily path of a modern office worker. When they leave home early in the morning, grandparents are often the ones stepping in to care for the young children. Another family member might be preparing the evening meal. A single corporate salary is rarely just for the individual. It is fractured to cover rising rent, imported groceries, education, and the quiet support of aging relatives. We cannot measure the economy here merely by a paycheck. We must look at how one income sustains multiple generations under the same roof. This rapid modernization forces a difficult conversation. Are these new jobs enough to keep the youth on the island? As the cost of living climbs, many who leave to study in Europe, Canada, or Australia find it increasingly hard to return. Will the traditional trades and languages survive another generation? Does economic progress inevitably mean walking away from the village and the family? We often teach our children to travel far to build a better life. But there comes a day when the better house is finally built, yet the chairs around the dining table slowly begin to empty. In Mauritius, opportunity is not only found inside air-conditioned towers. The rest of the world knows this island through an entirely different image, a paradise carved into the coastline. Look closely at a single stretch of white sand. A visitor sees a tranquil, sunlit escape. A hotel employee sees the beginning of a demanding 12-hour shift. A local fisherman sees his only source of livelihood. And a conservationist sees a fragile ecosystem fighting to survive. When a cyclone strikes the island, these parallel worlds are forced into the open. A luxury resort relies on industrial generators, reinforced infrastructure, and comprehensive insurance. Just a few miles down the coast, a local family's resilience depends entirely on the strength of their roof. The safety of a small wooden boat tied to a dock, and their ability to endure several days of lost wages. These resorts do not operate in isolation. Behind the manicured lawns and infinity pools is a vast, invisible network. The hotel runs because of the vegetable grower in the highlands, the fisherman navigating the reef, the taxi driver, the laundry staff, and the grandparents caring for children while their parents work the night shift. Tourism is not a separate world. It bleeds directly into thousands of local homes. But sustaining paradise comes at a heavy cost. Mauritius must import the vast majority of its fuel and consumer goods. When global prices shift, the impact hits the Mauritian dinner table immediately. Land is finite, sparking a quiet war between luxury real estate, agriculture, local housing, and conservation. Meanwhile, the ocean is warming, and coastal erosion is slowly consuming the shoreline. For the locals, this is not an abstract environmental lecture. It is measured in the rising price of daily fish, fewer safe days at sea, and the unpredictable income of seasonal workers. Paradise is often measured by what the visitor gets to see. Life is measured by what the people living there must pay to keep that image alive. Long before Mauritius became a sanctuary for leisure, a towering mountain in the southwest was a place people sought for an entirely different reason, simply so they would not be owned. Today, Morne appears in glossy advertisements, wedding photos, and scenic helicopter flights. But for generations, the people of Mauritius have looked at this mountain with an entirely different memory. During the era of slavery, those who managed to escape, known as Maroons, sought refuge in the island's most inaccessible terrains. The treacherous cliffs of Morne offered a natural fortress. The geography isolated them, but it also kept them safe. Over time, this towering peak became the ultimate symbol of resistance and the desperate human craving for freedom. Today, it is recognized as a World Heritage Site, not merely for its landscape, but for the heavy history it holds. According to a story passed down through community memory, when men were sent up the mountain following the abolition of slavery to announce that they were finally free, the Maroons misunderstood. Seeing the authorities approaching, they believed they were about to be captured and dragged back into chains. Legend tells us that rather than return to a life of slavery, many chose to leap into the abyss. The exact historical details of that day are still debated by researchers. But the enduring power of this story lies in what the community has chosen to remember, just how immense the fear of losing one's freedom once was. Not every human wound is recorded in official documents. some survive only in the way a family tells a story, in an annual day of remembrance, and in the quiet understanding that a mountain is never just a rock. One place on this island remembers those who had to hide from power. Another place welcomes hundreds of thousands of people walking voluntarily toward faith. And it is on that exhausting road that the question of living together finally receives an answer. The festival of Maha Shivaratri transforms the roads of the island. Hundreds of thousands of Hindu pilgrims begin a long journey on foot toward the sacred crater lake of Grand Bassin. They carry heavy wooden shrines on their shoulders. Some walk for a few miles, while others travel for days across the island. The physical toll is visible everywhere. Blistered feet against the hard asphalt, clothes soaked in sweat, and families slowing their pace so the elders can keep up. But along these exhausting miles, an extraordinary network of support appears. Stalls line the roads, offering large pots of hot food, continuous pours of fresh water, and shaded places to rest. The people stirring the food and wiping down the tables do not stop. And the most remarkable part is this: these stalls are not solely run by Hindus. Members of the Muslim, Christian, and Sino-Mauritian communities stand for hours in the heat to feed and hydrate pilgrims they will likely never see again. Perhaps what makes this scene so profoundly moving is not that they all believe in the exact same God. It is that they do not need to share a religion to recognize when another human being is thirsty. This is the truest definition of vivre ensemble. It is not about erasing differences. It is not about pretending that history never caused division. It is simply about repeating enough small acts of care so that someone else can keep walking. And perhaps the final question is no longer what Mauritius has learned, but what the rest of the world has forgotten. Mauritius does not prove that differences naturally create harmony. It proves that harmony is a continuous act of labor. It is work done in the quiet exchanges of the morning market. It is practiced in the multilingual chatter around the family dinner table. It is demonstrated on a crowded road during a pilgrimage. And in the careful way, a dark history is acknowledged rather than buried. It is the conscious decision to never let difference turn into alienation. The 7 colored earths of Chamarel will never blend into a single, uniform shade. Their true value, much like the people of this island, lies entirely in their ability to exist vividly side by side. We are living in an era with more tools for connection than any generation before us. Yet, sometimes, we have no idea who would answer the door if we needed help. Do we really need to be exactly the same to live together? Or do we just need to remember how to recognize when someone else needs a cup of water? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. Does the place where you live still hold a true sense of community? Or have you ever been helped through a difficult moment by a complete stranger? Let me know, and I will see you in the next journey.